My name is Jeff Gedman with the American Interest. We have a fabulous group joined and joining. We'll have a few more as time moves on, the next couple or few minutes. It's my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to this conversation. We're strict. We run an hour. We keep it tight. We have a guest of honor and Q&A, and then we keep everybody on time, both the speaker and everybody for dinner plans or what have you. So Bill Kristol, welcome to you. Bill has, it's one of those things, you know, he needs no introduction, but he deserves an introduction. Bill is known, certainly to everybody on this line, as an editor and writer and speaker, and he's got legislative and executive branch experience, and founded and ran the Weekly Standard for splendid years, and founded Bulwark, and is, you know, I don't like the expression, but he's a policy entrepreneur. He creates stuff and moves stuff as a thinker and a writer and a doer, if I may put it that way. And he's a friend and someone who I regard so highly. When I took the job running the American Interest exactly 18 months ago, thanks to Charles Davidson, who's with us today, co-founder and publisher, and thanks to Frank Fukuyama, who joined Charles in founding it 15 years ago. One of the first people I went to was Bill to say, how do you do this? And how do you think about this? And how do we make this everything it can and should be, building on wonderful work already done? Bill and I initially thought, 2 weeks ago, that we'd talk about reestablishing a center and bipartisan consensus for U.S. foreign policy, and we may still talk about that, Bill. But in the last couple days, we discussed the turmoil and the conflict we're seeing across the United States right now, and we thought we should talk about that. You wrote yesterday for the Bulwark a piece that got my attention for more reasons than one. I'm not used to Bill Kristol writing political commentary where in the first paragraph he cites a play by Gotthold Lessing called Nathan der Weise. Nathan der Wise, it's an 18th century play, a kind of an iconic piece in German literature. That caught my eye. The rest of the piece I liked very much. Bill, let's start there. Anywhere you want, really, but I wouldn't mind if you started with your piece yesterday in Bulwark and Nathan der Weise, Nathan the Wise, and what you're thinking and how you can help us understand and navigate the current crisis. Bill, welcome.
Thank you, Jeff. It's good to be with you and with all of you. And I will say that I remember having a very pleasant lunch when you took over. I have no idea of what advice or quasi advice I gave you, but whatever it was, either it was good advice since you've done such a terrific job, really, at the American Interest, or maybe it was bad advice and you intelligently ignored it. But either way, the magazine really it was always good and important and interesting, but really, I think it's become central, honestly. And I think we're doing our thing at the Bulwark over at Defending Democracy Together, and I think somewhat different styles or different lanes, but I think complementary in terms of trying to foster intelligent discussion about the challenges here and abroad. I also thought your little introduction was very typically Gedman-esque, if I can say that, because you said you would let everyone go at 7 in case they had dinner plans. That's such an amusing thought these days, you know. But you probably do have. The rest of us, of course, are going to walk 10 feet, I assume, to our dinner plans, you know, which will be very much like our dinner plans for the last 3 months. But in your case, you probably really have dinner plans. The piece I wrote, well, so just to give a tiny bit of background, yeah, you would appreciate, of course, having studied German literature and so much a mention of Lessing, whom I know, as I say in the piece, I knew very little about and still know very little about. But it was one of these, it was a reading group. It would have been in person at one point, not a more study group, I guess you'd say, really focused on the thought of Leo Strauss, the political philosopher who had a huge influence here through many students and through his writings, obviously. And one of his students was Harvey Mansfield, who was my teacher. So many people have an interest in Strauss's thought. Strauss was very influenced by Lessing when Strauss was a young man in his 30s, in the 30s, 20s and 30s in Germany, but didn't end up writing much on Lessing. Left some notes actually for a chapter he meant to write and never did. But anyway, that was actually the reason and Nathan the Wise is famous for other reasons, of course. I think the first play in European literature that has a Jew as a hero and the title role and very conspicuously Jewish, not sort of accidentally happened to be born to Jewish parents. And of course, in 1770 in Germany, this was an interesting thing for Lessing, who wasn't Jewish, to do. So the play is famous in other ways and very deep when you study it a little bit. And I guess the point of my piece was, we in this discussion, being most of the people in it were serious students of political philosophy and close readers of texts and so forth, they found all the depths, or not, they didn't find all the depths. They found some of the depths of the play, the complexity. The play on the surface is a very sort of straightforward, you'd almost say, defense of liberal tolerance, enlightenment, respecting each faith should respect the other. That's how it's taken generally. I think it's how it was taken at the time. It's how it's taken today. It was performed a fair amount after 9/11, I would say, in the US, and there's an example of a Muslim, a Jew, and a Christian ending up more or less getting along after a lot of tension earlier in the play. When you read the play at all carefully, you see that Lessing's thought is much more complicated. He is an Enlightenment thinker, but it's not so easy just to get to tolerance, and there is a price to be paid, and it's not clear that the happy ending is really, a satisfactory resolution or quite as happy as one thinks. It has all the normal complexities of a serious work of literature. But the point of my piece was, we should. Someone in the discussion, yes, Saturday, I guess it was, said, this is all very deep and interesting, but we should also remember the surface of it, which is a plea for basically enlightened tolerance and respect for others and for other faiths, and an attempt that they should make an attempt to get along. And he, in fact, one of the people in the group mentioned Rodney King and his famous statement, can't we just get along, from 1992, slightly ironically, obviously. But he made an important point. I mean, Lessing knew what he was doing, and for all the complexities, he did want this to be the kind of teaching, the public effect of the play in 1770 in Europe. And discussing it in the context of what's happening here, both in the last few days, but also more broadly in terms of the rise of authoritarianism, the contempt for sort of simple liberalism from both the left and the right. I made the point that maybe we could learn something from Lessing and from Rodney King, and the basics of liberalism are very important to preserve and defend, for all the complexities that most of us know, of why liberalism can be problematic and what its weaknesses are and how it has to be complemented by other things and all that. But so I wrote a very piece I probably wouldn't have written or thought of writing 5, 6, 7 years ago. It wouldn't have seemed necessary, wouldn't have been as alarmed, I guess. Maybe I had become complacent too, from the conservative side, about conservatives' commitment to basic liberal principles. That certainly was a mistake to the degree I was complacent. And I think we see real challenges, abroad and at home. And we forget how, I'll just go on too long, but I'll just say one more thing. Everyone forgets, how fragile a kind of decent liberal order is, both internationally and at home. And that's what really has struck me so much over the last few years.
Bill, thank you. I'm tempted to ask two questions. Let me refrain. It's already 6:12 time races, and we're aiming for a punctual stop at 7 p.m. Let me just open up the floor and invite other people to join in. Who would have a first question?
You don't have to be a Lessing expert to ask the question,
So as people are thinking, Bill, I'm going to ask you, it seems to me, I talked to one of our young colleagues, Aaron, today, about the current crisis and violence in cities across America, to be in part in the political realm a battle of narratives too, depending on your point of view, ideology, if you will, left to right. How do you see that? How do you understand what's happening? How do you identify priorities and roots of the problem? That's big, but how do you sort the narratives that are emerging as people explain what's happening, how we ought to deal with it in the short term, and what the deeper roots are?
I mean, there were very deep roots, and those roots, some of them are peculiar to America, obviously, into race relations, our history of race relations. But it's not as if riots don't happen in other countries at times of stress, also. And this has been a time of stress, both in terms of public health, but especially economically, and like, suppose everything came together in a sense. I do think, I personally, as a sort of someone mostly on the right side of the political spectrum for most of my adult life, and a defender of law and order, I think for good motive. Well, I still would be a defender of law and order properly understood, but a defender of, let's say, the conservative side in some of these arguments about, how criminal justice policy and how important it was to be tough on crime. For good motives, I think, in the sense that you wouldn't have had the resurgence of New York City and of other cities if you didn't have the crime rate go down by an awful lot over the last 25, 30 years, et cetera. But I have been shocked over the last few years by what I've seen and what we've all seen about police behavior. I'm more sympathetic to the complaints of African Americans and others as well about the police. And then you see what's happened recently, obviously, and it is genuinely shocking. It does not justify riots, and it certainly doesn't justify looting of property or killing innocent people, and that's really been terrible too. So that's, this is a case where one side leads to the other, and hopefully it'll now, I hope, die down some. And I do think one has to mention Donald Trump, whose lack of leadership is conspicuous in the last few days, but who has contributed to. He's an effect of what's happening what's been happening anyway before, but has really contributed to the coarsening of behavior and rhetoric in America in a way that I'd say a lot of the more sophisticated Trump defenders would say to someone like me, who's more of an alarmist perhaps about Trump, well, he says these things, it's really vulgar and it's unfortunate. I wish he didn't say this, but it's just tweets, and, here the basic policies are the same and the country's not burning down. I mean, someone literally said that to me, I remember, a few months ago, so just calm down. And then, and these are usually the prefaces to people explaining why they're really going to vote for him reluctantly and so forth in 2020. And I do think the degree to which he has, removed or eroded some of the normal constraints that would limit rhetorical excesses, which do lead to and go along with actual excesses. Trump has to bear some responsibility as well.
Bill, thank you. David Kramer, can you hear me? So I could ask this question, David, to you or a number of people, Michael Bromwitz, for example. David, how difficult, and then I'm going to take it back to Bill, the same question. How difficult does this make your work, where you are principally engaged with the advocacy and defense of democracy and rule of law abroad, when abroad adversaries and allies look at the United States and see a blemished president in the person of Donald Trump and, let's say, significant social problems, conflict, turmoil? How hard does that make it for the United States to be a leader and advance these things around the world? And I'll ask the same thing to Bill after you take your first crack.
Sure. Well, thanks, Jeff. And Mike, I'm sure, can jump in, as can many others on this conversation. I think it makes it incredibly difficult. I think it actually lends some weight to the whataboutism counters that we get when we raise concerns about what's happening in other countries. And this has been true. It isn't just under Trump. It started perhaps under the Bush administration, in which I served, with Abu Ghraib and other things. And the way I dealt with it at the time when I was in the government was to acknowledge our mistakes and to acknowledge that we are not perfect, and to bring some sense of humility to the charge we had, which was to still press other countries when they engaged in gross human rights abuses and anti-democratic behavior. I think it continued in the Obama administration, but I think it's on steroids in the Trump administration. And I think it has become much more difficult for those in this effort to raise concerns about other countries without having it get thrown back in our face and without our being able to have much of a defense and response to that. Again, I think the way to do it is with a probably even stronger dose of humility and acknowledgement of our shortcomings, but to say, we can't wait to get our house in order. We all need to work together on this.
So Bill, I've got Nicole Penn and Giselle Donnelly waiting, and yet you have the word. Could you respond to that, please?
Just a quick word. Yeah, I hate to keep such distinguished people waiting, but just a quick word. I mean, not that Trump has been very vigorous to say at all about raising any of these concerns, as David and Mike and others know. So that I think we paid a real price for. I mean, the degree to which people can say we're being hypocritical, or different presidents have done this in different ways, and some have been quieter about some allies than others, and so forth. But to have a president simply, in effect, be pro-Putin is pretty, and pro-Xi for that matter, until it happened. China, unfortunately, was the source of the virus, so that he sort of reversed on that. I mean, that's pretty astonishing, and I would say pretty unusual. Certainly, I mean, Nixon would be the closest to that, but even Nixon and Kissinger, there was a complicated sort of geopolitical rationale, and even there, a little more of a nod towards some concern for democracy abroad. So I think that's and that's obviously made the task, that first made the task harder, and now it's doubly hard because of what people see about the U.S. The other thing I would just say quickly is, it's a trope among some people, this is sort of particularly among some of my libertarian friends, that, let's call it a muscular or a assertive U.S. foreign policy, which is interested in the character of regimes abroad and promoting liberal democracy, mostly peacefully, hopefully. But that's sort of, that's bad. It's a trade-off between that and having a free republic at home. That's been a trope of a lot of thinkers in Britain and America, and I'm sure everywhere for quite a long time. It's not without some truth, obviously. There's a way in which war is the health of the state and not healthy for civil liberties. Think of Woodrow Wilson and Roosevelt with the internment of the Japanese. Having said that, I've always thought the opposite argument was equally strong. That in fact it helped in it was a terrible hypocrisy for us to be lecturing the Soviets and others when we had Jim Crow laws, obviously, in the South. And this was pointed out by communists and fellow travelers, as well as by, earnest people, civil rights reformers, who said this is a hypocrisy. But it ultimately made it easier, I think. I mean, it's not an accident for me that the civil rights movement and the Cold War actually happened at the same time. They weren't in tension with one another. If you are serious about promoting human rights and liberal democracy and liberties abroad, at some point it does kind of kick back on you at home, sometimes maybe even if you don't want it to. And I would say the opposite, incidentally. So I think the retreat from the promotion of liberal democracy abroad, which has been treated as kind of a foreign policy issue and debate, and there's, David and Mike and me and the people who sort of believe in promotion of liberal democracy and the quote realists who don't, and that's kind of just an interesting debate about foreign policy, but it has real effects on domestic policy here. And I think that's a sort of, in that respect, Trump's authoritarianism at home does go hand in hand with his friendliness to authoritarians abroad. And I think, so I think that too has really been, they do go, as I say, I think they go much more hand in hand than they're in some tension. They can be in tension with one another, but I think they're more hand in hand than some people have acknowledged.
Can I just say very quickly, because I know you got a list there, Jeff. I 100% agree with Bill. I was thinking a little more when I was mentioning from the NGO to the side.
Right.
Bill, I actually think it's even worse than what you just described in terms of Trump's embrace of these leaders, talking about his favorite dictator and Sisi, engaging in a cover-up with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia on the murder of an American resident. So I 100% agree with you.
David, thank you. And Bill, thank you. So we do have a list now, and I'm going to call on Nicole Penn, and then after Nicole, Giselle. And Nicole, tell us who you are.
Hi, my name is Nicole Penn, and I'm the Program Manager of Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. So I was wondering, Bill, I mean, you've been a Republican strategist for decades. What do you think of the law and order approach? Getting back to the conversation of the current unrest over police brutality, do you think that this is going to be a successful way of maintaining Trump's base? Do you see any movement on the right to really, abandon for people who might have been waffling between Trump and Biden? Or is this, is the status quo set in stone? And this will no more hurt or help Trump than, perhaps impeachment or coronavirus. Thank you.
Thanks, Nicole. Bill, would you like to reply to that?
Yeah. I mean, it's a good question, and God knows, it's risky making predictions about politics in general and about Trump's political standing in particular, since he surprises one both ways, I suppose. I generally think. So I mean, it's been a conventional view, true view, I think, that the law and order helped Republicans and conservatives over the last 40 years or 50 years or so as an issue. The Democrats seeming soft, especially on crime, was certainly a big issue. And in some respects, it was a legitimate issue. Crime did go up a lot in America over a couple of decades, and there was a perception that Republicans were tougher. And conversely, it went down in places like New York, and Giuliani and Bloomberg got themselves elected and reelected there in a city that's not friendly to Republicans or even independents like Bloomberg normally. So I think there is some truth to the notion that the prominence of law and order can help conservatives or tough guys, but it's one thing to be, but he's president. And I think for me, that probably trumps the other thing. It's all falling apart on his watch. That he's been president for 3 years and 3.5 years. And so he can complain, I suppose, that some of these cities have Democratic mayors or states have Democratic governors. But generally speaking, if you're the president and the economy is not good and public health issue hasn't been handled well at all, and then there are riots and you don't seem to have much of a solution to it, to say either kind of a solution of urging people at least to come together or an actual solution. I'm not sure there really is one in that way. I tend to think it doesn't help. I'd be pretty surprised if this helps Trump and if he can sort of play that card the way, let's say, Nixon could in '68 as a challenger to a Democratic administration and when Democrats controlled the presidency and Congress and most states and most cities. And so you really could say, gee, we really need a change. So I'm a little doubtful about Trump's ability to play that to play that card. And I would say just looking at the reaction, and this is very hard to tell, tentative, but in the 72 hours or so since things have really blown up, I don't see a huge rallying. I don't see anyone much saying, I was kind of thinking of converting Trump and now I'm going back to him. And I see a little more of the other actually, and we're doing this Republican vote against Trump thing out of Defending Democracy Together. So we're getting a certain number of videos sent in, and obviously it's hundreds of thousands and it's not millions. So I don't know what it reflects, but I think there are more people who are maybe on the fence saying that, geez, this just can't go on this way. We're paying a real price for the divisiveness. I mean, insofar as one of the reluctant Trump voter or the reluctant Trump apologist, Renee Blair, one of their arguments was, well, he's vulgar, he's unattractive in so many ways, but we don't really pay a real fundamental price for it. But he's too strong, society's too strong, people ignore him, he's just tweeting. To say paying no price for Trump and everything he does, I think, after the last few days.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Nicole. Now, of course, it's 6:26. We're good for time, except I have a bunch of people who want to speak.
I'll be short in my answers.
No, it wasn't meant that way. Oh my gosh, you're so sensitive, Bill. It wasn't meant that way.
Try to be accommodating, Jeff.
It wasn't meant that way. It was meant to the questioners. And oh my God, Giselle Donnelly is next, and we could have paragraphs in a book. Giselle Donnelly, tell us who you are.
Well, I also work at the American Enterprise Institute. I'm technically speaking in the foreign and defense policy shop, but I try to encroach on Nicole's territory as much as I can. And I'm willing to trade my slot for a power hitting shortstop. So, but my question is, Bill, you and I have always consoled one another by remembering the durability of liberalism over recent centuries. I have to say, I'm kind of depressed, and I could use a shot of Kristol optimism because it feels like 1968, and I'm not 15 anymore. What do you see? How does this fix itself, resolve itself? If not Trump, then the Democratic Party. It's a devilish choice.
Well, now I really am shaken because you wrote the piece of, I think, a month or 6 weeks ago in the American Interest, explaining that liberalism often comes back when it looks like it's on the ropes, and way back into the 18th century, right? So now I am worried.
I'm wavering.
I don't know. I mean, I suppose if just take the 1968 example, it wasn't the end of liberal democracy in the United States, and in some ways, the next decades didn't roll back the civil rights revolution, and they didn't stop progress in other areas of human rights, and they didn't stop, healthy debate. I mean, there was Watergate, I guess, but that didn't. We got through that, got recovered from that, okay, as well. So. I guess that I'm not sure which way the 1968. I mean, six things really felt bad in '68, and now, having said that, one shouldn't, just because we made it through other past crises doesn't mean we make it through this one intact. And I mean, we'll make it through intact, but we'll make it through. But I mean, we may not make it through with everything we like about our country and our polity intact, and things will have to be rebuilt. And I just have the general sense that if you combine the end of, I take it, but I think what people look before, let me put it this way, before the riots and before COVID, I think I wrote a little piece in the Bulwark in February, so it was before COVID really hit, that this really seemed like the end of an era. People always say everything's the end of an era, and an era is coming, we're always starting and ending, so one shouldn't overdo this. But I just felt like the 30-year period of the post-Cold War era, which I suppose you could argue is the last half of the 75-year period of the post-World War II international liberal order, did feel like it would have to be reconstituted in a pretty fundamental way, or not, or would fall apart, or would change into something else. And it feels like at home, just the way the economy works, the way social changes and so forth, that there was some fresh thinking needed on both sides. Both conservatism, from my point of view, really is intellectually exhausted. Liberalism is pretty intellectually exhausted as a movement. It's, in my view, right now, sort of in better shape, more decent than conservatism. And Joe Biden is a decent man and a reasonable person, I think. It's not exactly an exciting vision of the future, I would say, and he himself doesn't claim to be. He's a transitional figure. So transitional to what? So I felt even before the last few months that we were probably at a moment where really fresh thinking was required, that it wouldn't be enough to just, to save or to reform or to reconstitute the previous order, but it really needed to be built anew, almost, or rebuilt, but rather built anew. Now that's easy to say and hard to do, so I think the challenges are very great. I mean, I do agree with that. But as you've pointed out in your work, it's happened before, but it will happen again. But I do think it will require more sort of bolder thinking and bolder institutional efforts and intellectual efforts, perhaps, than just kind of getting rid of some things that went wrong slightly and getting back to where we were. I don't really feel that it's plausible at this point that we're going to get back to where we were exactly.
So Bill, I'm going to take the liberty of asking a follow-on to that, and then we'll go on to several others who are waiting patiently. So you and I have a friend, an economist named Erwin Steltzer, who is a TAI contributing editor, and Erwin for years has told me, "That sounds great, Jeff. How are you going to pay for it?" So when we come through and out of this crisis, both the turmoil and riots and COVID, we're going to have a battle over domestic priorities. We're going to have some sort of a recession, I think. And then we have other crises and challenges abroad like China. And they all take the generation of wealth with which we can allocate resources. I did mention deficits and debt. How do you navigate that? And whoever the next president is, how do you counsel them on priorities, negotiating the polarization so that with what we have, we can get the most.
And Giselle's written about this over the years, and we've written together, and it is worrisome because there's just the core defense. I mean, I assume if you're thinking of here as the kind of foreign policy agendas in particular, which requires healthy defense capabilities and also healthy foreign policy capabilities, which State Department and intelligence and public diplomacy and other things that directly and indirectly help us. I mean, the good news is that's a very small part of it's a reasonably small part of our national budget. As you know, it's a very small part really of our GDP. And even if GDP gets constricted a bit, it's still not that big a part. So in the real world, if you kind of came down from Mars and looked at the US, we are wealthy enough to do what we have to do, I think, to maintain a reasonable liberal order, to confront our adversaries, help if we work closely with our allies instead of antagonizing them all the time. But presumably that could change. And incidentally, it's not as if China and Russia are going to do so great out of this depression either. So it's not as if one side is getting that much stronger than the other. It is worrisome though, but if everyone gets weaker together, it helps authoritarians, or it helps chaos. I've always gone back and forth in my mind about whether the threat is China or Russia or these different authoritarians. Obviously it is in some ways, in particular ways, whether the broader threat is chaos. I mean, are we facing a pure competitor that's going to eclipse us, or are we facing, or is it, the end of the Roman Empire, whatever, 470, whatever that was, something AD, where just everything kind of falls apart. It sort of feels to me like that's as much of a threat, but the two aren't mutually exclusive, right? Things fall apart in the world, and some authoritarians also get stronger regionally and so forth. So I don't think it's beyond our resources to deal with this, but you do need some national will to do so. And that people will look at the defense budget as an obvious, how can we spend so little on cities, I suppose, and so much on defense? And people this is a problem with a total lack of presidential leadership in the last 3.5 years on these kinds of issues. And I think some lack from President Obama. And actually President Bush, I think, did his best. I mean, he was so preoccupied with 9/11, he probably couldn't lay out this and its aftermath in Iraq, that he didn't lay out this argument quite as broadly as he might have. People underestimate how bad things can get and how quickly they can get bad in the world. I mean, we take for granted what still is, despite everything, a pretty decent liberal world order out there with a fair number of people living under reasonable regimes, and it's still hard to invade other countries and so forth, and a lot of the last 75 years is a pretty impressive achievement, really, in world history. And it's either scorned, which is really ridiculous, I think, or dismissed as well. That's just the way the 20th and 21st century are going to be, which I think the good news is I think people are seeing that that's not the case. And if we pay, 3.5% of GDP for defense, and another percent for state, for diplomacy and intelligence, and another percent for random other things that help us abroad, and if we take some hits even from a sort of free trade regime, and then we pay some price for that at home in certain areas, but if that helps knit countries together and helps really poor countries develop and so forth, I mean, I think that's a price well worth paying. And the alternative, but people just haven't focused on, it's been so long maybe, that really think through what the alternative scenario is. And I do think people kind of assume, well, if it gets a little worse, we'll have some time to recoup. And sometimes, yes, but sometimes not. Things can unravel very fast when they start to unravel. There's that kind of snowball effect or tipping point or whatever metaphor you want. And I do worry about that abroad. I've been worrying much more about that abroad than at home. A year ago, I was sort of saying, I think our institutions at home are pretty strong. The country's pretty strong. We'll survive Trump with some price, some cost. Abroad is really where I think the liberal world order is much shakier than the domestic liberal order, for obvious reasons. We've had this going a longer time, and we have a lot of institutions built up. But of course, now the order here at home looks a little shaky as well. And again, those two things the shakiness of one impacts the shakiness of the other.
Bill, thank you. I have a good bunch now. If you take a look, there are internal comments. And then there are also questions, and I'm trying to sort sometimes which is which. Tui Schaub, you had, I'm not certain, either a comment or a question to relay from Nils Gilman, or both maybe. Could I call on you next?
Sure thing. Hi, Jeff. Hi, Bill.
Hi,
So the first question was from Nils. Let me find it here. I'm sorry. Oh, it's not there anymore. Oh, yes. What scenarios do you see unfolding in terms of U.S. leadership over the next 5 to 10 years? And Nils is watching by YouTube, so he asked me to post this.
I don't know. I mean, there's such a variety of scenarios. Obviously, it looks kind of grim now, but as Giselle pointed out, it can sometimes looks dark. Looks darkest before the dawn. I was going to say, whenever I say that, I remember John McCain. I'm sure David and others remember this so well. Always laughing and saying that, pretending to quote Chairman Mao. This was like a conceit of McCain's that it was quoting Chairman Mao, when he just made this up, I think. But he used to say, as Chairman Mao used to like to say, it's always darkest before it turns pitch black. And he would laugh heartily. And I've been using that in speeches quite a lot in the last 4 or 5 years. And I guess, it can get bad. We shouldn't kid ourselves. I mean, that's why I do think, from my point of view, I'm anti-Trump, obviously, so I don't want to presume for anyone else. But I mean, I do think a second term of Trump is qualitatively more dangerous than even a first term of, let's assume, a bad case for Biden, which may not be fair, incidentally, but let's say a fairly ineffectual, Democratic president who perhaps isn't the most decisive leader and so forth. But I just think the dangers to liberal democracy of a second term for Trump really are, and dangers abroad, are much greater. But I also don't think we, with Biden, I think we then have the question of, who succeeds, or how effective can he be? And that's an interesting question about the nature of the Democratic Party and fights within it, both on foreign and domestic policy. But I guess for our purposes, obviously, in foreign policy, quite dramatic differences between what we say the Bill Clinton Democrats and others to the left of Obama, really, and Biden. I think I'm pleased that Biden's the nominee and will be the nominee, and not Bernie Sanders, and so that's something. And then there's the question of the Republican Party. Let's assume Trump loses. He doesn't go away. Trumpism doesn't go away. 3 years ago, I think I would have said, yeah, I think we'll have a fight, but we might be able to recapture it. There'll be some price to be paid for, let's say, Reagan, McCain, Romney, Bush type Republican Party. I'm quite dubious about that now. And going forward, having a situation where one of the two major parties isn't really committed, let's leave aside domestic policy even, but isn't committed to the basics, what I would regard as the basics of the international liberal order, that's itself very problematic, obviously. It's been a huge advantage for all the problems we've had to have both parties basically, not all the time, but almost all the time, most of the time, most of each party, most of the time, maybe, and at decisive moments, I would say, at those moments coming through in defense of this order since 48, right? Since right after the war, for all the mistakes, the challenges from the left were beat back by Truman and by Kennedy and Johnson to some degree, and Bill Clinton, and from the right, the kind of isolationists were beat back by Eisenhower, obviously, and then Reagan sort of turned the conservative movement into an internationalist movement. And so in both parties, you had what I would regard as reasonably healthy attitudes towards the world, and you can't count on that. Can't count on it for the Democrats. They seem okay for now. Certainly can't count on it for the Republicans. So that itself is a big challenge, I think, to American leadership.
Bill, thank you. Tui, thank you. Did you have a follow-on comment?
Sorry, yes, actually, kind of brings me to the point of, we used to have a space for patriotic opposition, and you get vilified for having, seeing the sense from the other side. And Jeff also frequently talks about how fragile democracies and liberal democracies are. How do we find the space to have this be a joint, see the value of the basic tenets of liberalism, and how do we protect those across aisles? I mean, there just seems to be that seems to be an urgent thing we need to consider. And yet everything seems to be polarized.
Yeah, so I mean, that's obviously a huge point. And I mean, hyperpolarization itself is a problem. Lack of leadership willing to stand up against the hyperpolarization is a problem. And the fact that leadership gets pushed aside pretty quickly when it does try to stand up is a problem. And so I think we just need to hope that so I'll say on the good side, I do think there are a younger generation. I've had great hopes for the 9/11 generation. I think we called it the Weekly Standard over 10 years ago, especially the young men and women who've been involved, many of whom fought, but let's say have been involved more broadly post 9/11 and trying to deal with that, the challenges of 9/11 and related challenges, and now with other challenges around the world. In a certain way, I actually am more optimistic about the millennial, the much derided millennials than a lot of my fellow baby boomers. Maybe I'm a little more critical of my fellow baby boomers as well. So there are some signs of hope, I think. And I think people do understand the current situation is just untenable and unhealthy. And in their lives, they don't behave the way they see people behaving in Congress. And it just seems a little crazy. So I guess I'm a little, I mean, Trump's ability to take reasonable Republicans and turn them into not so reasonable Republicans has been demoralizing on that. But I do think Trump is a big problem. I mean, I don't want to keep coming back to Trump, but we had Joe McCarthy, we had Henry Wallace, we had a lot of things in America that were problematic. But none of those people like that were president. I think the thought experiment here is, what if Joe McCarthy had become president in 1952, which isn't incidentally such a crazy thought. I don't think, he was a very prominent senator and he could have run and he would have won. So Eisenhower was there, it's kind of, Ed Taft was there actually blocking McCarthy, fortunately, probably. I mean, but when you have a president, when you have a nominee of a major party, first of all, who embraces what Trump embraces, that's a big problem. That's not like having a governor from a southern state who can cause a lot of damage, but ends up winning 5 states. It's not like having a senator who can be a demagogue. It can intimidate his colleagues mostly for a few years, but ends up getting marginalized by the president of his own party and by others. Having a nominee is a big deal. Having the nominee win and be president, and then having him as president not moderate at all, and quite the contrary, double down on the demagoguery. That really, we just haven't gone through that experiment, actually. I mean, we've been very fortunate not to, certainly not in the last century, I would say. So that's where I don't know. How much damage does that do? Does the system, assuming Trump loses, does the system kind of shake that off as like, oh, that was kind of a bad 4 years and let's get back to something resembling normalcy? I don't feel that that's quite as easy as some Republicans hope. Especially, I think once the Republican Party has gone down that path, a little hard to throw that down a memory hole. And also, it's not like Trump and the Trump family and Trumpists and Trumpism go away, right? That's where I think the Republican situation is so worrisome. I would do this thought experiment. In 2022, let's assume Trump loses by, even if he loses, not kind of by a pretty big margin, 8 points or something. In 2022, will it be better to be a Trump skeptical candidate in a Republican Senate or congressional primary, or better to be a Trump loyalist? I fear that it'll be better to be a Trump loyalist. And if that's the case, I fear that in 2024, we have a younger Trumpite running as the Republican candidate. Now, maybe the Democrats will have done great and there's no problem, and that person will get defeated convincingly. And then sort of the Republicans come to their senses. But we're not sure about that. And that's where, so I think it's that the Republican side of things worries me the most in that respect. And then, God knows what could happen. What if Biden's just unlucky and, things are very tough? He'll take over a very difficult situation and he doesn't, things don't turn out so great. And he looks like he's not such a successful president. Which way do the Democrats go? Do they go to a responsible successor or do they embrace some irresponsible proposals? So you could have 2 irresponsible parties, let's say by 2024 in the US, 2 irresponsible presidential candidates. And that again is something we've pretty much been spared. And that worries me. I don't know, I seem to be getting more and more depressing myself, and I hope I'm not depressing all of you too much here before what Jeff calls the dinner hour. But I don't know.
You make me think
situation we face
before we go further south here, Bill. So Bill and Tui, thank you very much. So here's what we're going to do. Listen carefully. It's 6:47. If you have to excuse yourself at 7, to go to an important dinner, do so. But I have a list. That list is Tom Kent, Mike Abramowitz, Jeff Cabaservis, Jackie Deal, Ron Dvorkin, Susan Cork, Ellen Bork, and finally, a question from our publisher, Charles Davidson. Let me start grouping questions. And if you're succinct, we will be good. And let me invite Tom Kent, and then after Tom, Mike Abramowitz, please.
Hello, everyone. I'll be as succinct as I can. The question is...
and Tom, tell us who you are. I know, and many do, but maybe not all.
Sure. Tom Kent, formerly president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, now at Columbia University and working on Russian disinformation in particular. It's hard to remember anything before COVID and the latest unrest, but we did go through a year or so of a lot of pro-democracy or anti-corruption, pro-equality kinds of protests around the world. Do you think, Bill, that there is, that it might be fair to say that agitation for democracy against corruption and so forth has reached some kind of takeoff speed where US leadership is not as essential as it used to be, or does a lot still depend on the United States?
Tom, thank you. And Bill, hold your fire on that. Mike, could you join right now? Mike Abramowitz?
Sure. Thanks, Jeff. Bill, you've kind of touched upon this.
Mike, tell us that you're the president of Freedom House, please.
Yeah, I'm the president of Freedom House. And Bill, I just was curious, I guess particularly with the Republican Party, I'm just curious whether you see any potential for more pro-human rights, pro-democracy, some of the kind of, principled advocacy for kind of a values-based foreign policy that, you associated with better for good with people like Reagan or second Bush. I'm just kind of curious if you think that kind of strain is dead in the Republican Party.
So Mike, thank you. And Bill, before you do, please, Jeff, Jackie, Ron, Susan, Ellen, did any of you want to ask about this question of pro-democracy in GOP or democracy in American leadership? Because if so, I'd get you in right now. We'll hold. Phil, over to you.
Look, I mean, both good. I think, Tom, it's a good reminder that there were heartening signs around the world, obviously, last year of a kind of, there's people do want freedom, and they don't just wait for an American president to signal it. So, and that's, of course, been true historically and true in other countries and other eras. So I think that's a very good reminder. And there's also a way in which the breaking up of all the old structures can also break in a good way, right? I mean, so that there's a sense that maybe the authoritarians are less secure than we thought. I think that, who knows with China, but that's possible. So there's more at stake. There are more, more moving parts, but that can be a good thing. So I think that's a very good reminder. How much American leadership is needed? I think we probably flatter ourselves too much that everyone needs to look to America, either to American history, and it's nice, Statue of Liberty and all this, being carried around, or to current America. It seemed there for a while that everyone was looking to American history and ignoring the current American president and his rhetoric, which was impressive, actually. And it actually shows how powerful a symbol, or more than symbol, a thing America is in the world, as the founders hoped and expected it would be, an example so far successful of this of the experiment in self-government. So yeah, no, I think that's a very important thing to remember, and we shouldn't flatter ourselves that our own limitations necessarily mean no one else can seek for or achieve freedom, or understand how to seek for or achieve freedom. Having said all that, just as a practical matter, it's obviously better if you have an American, the United States of America is on the side of those demonstrators and protesters and people working and voting and agitating if they can in different countries. And we see that with Hong Kong, right? I mean, that is, to get to the second question, I mean, I was thinking about that. There is a lot of sentiment among Republican senators. They kind of remember they're anti-communist, anti-Chinese. In this case, it goes together, fits together in a little way with being, it's okay, but you can be pro-Trump and anti-China now, at least temporarily. So you can be sort of sympathetic to Hong Kong, not that Trump has said much about it. And we'll see how serious either party is about this moment, which is a big moment, I think, incidentally. If the Chinese communist regime gets away with, or Chinese regime, I guess it's communist, Chinese Communist Party, but the Chinese regime gets away with just suppressing this and pays no real price, I mean, that would be a pretty astonishing and depressing moment. So I think you never can predict where these things pop up, and it's heartening to see people care so much about freedom, but worrisome that we don't do much about it. So I think that'll be a test.
Thank you, Jeff and Jackie.
Hi, this is Jeff Kamservis. I'm the Director of Political Studies at the Niskanen Center. Bill, nice to see you again.
Yeah.
As you know, I'm fascinated by this kind of parallel between your intellectual career and your father's, the way your career in some ways has sort of seemed to recapitulate your father's trajectory in an opposite direction. But more generally, I guess, what strikes me is that the original generation of neoconservatives who came from a leftist background were actually mostly welcomed into the Republican Party under Reagan. Their perspective was applauded rather than being seen as some kind of foreign intrusion, although to be sure there were some conservatives who saw it as that. My question is, if the Never Trump faction is analogous to that original generation of Democratic neoconservatives, is the Democratic Party going to welcome in the Never Trumpers? Is it going to adapt in any way to their perspective, or is it going to be a kind of tribal repudiation and rejection rather than a welcoming of this kind of conversion?
Jeff, you want to take a couple of questions? You want to just answer?
Let's take Jackie Deal.
Thank you, Jeff. Hi, Bill. I'm wondering if you think maybe that a source of the much needed renewal on the conservative side and even on the liberal side of the aisle in the United States could be taking seriously the need to compete with the Chinese Communist Party regime in China. And I ask because respectable people who I admire have been saying, well, coronavirus is just kind of accelerating trends that were already underway. And I think that makes sense, but I think it might be wrong because from the Chinese Communist Party regime's point of view, and I've recently written a little bit about this in the American Interest, the Trump presidency, because of the trade war aspect of it, and then the coronavirus were, I don't know if you want to call them gray rhinos or black swans, but they were not part of the plan. And they are planning strategic people. They don't get everything right and they have many problems, but they make projections and they have a trajectory and they have expectations about where things are going to be. And we're at a moment now, I think, where the plan does not match the reality. So there is a real chance, I think, that if we took this challenge very seriously in its external security dimensions and its internal dimensions, because there is a way in which the presidency of Trump was made possible by the populist dissatisfaction with economic inequality in the United States that has to do with our relationship with China. It has to do with other things too, but much of it, I think economists have now shown, has to do with China's entry into WTO and the way that they were not adhering to their obligations and manipulating the system. So there are internal dimensions and there are external security dimensions clearly, and there are moral dimensions between Hong Kong and Xinjiang and Tibet and many other places, frankly. So this could be, I think, a cause that inspires new kinds of thinking and stresses us, but also brings out the best in us. Is that possible?
Yeah, it's certainly possible, and it would be good. I have a conversation with Aaron Friedberg. I just did, as I think a friend of both of ours, who thinks this really is an inflection point in U.S.-China relations. I mean, I'd say two things: the competition could be healthy. It can also be is consistent with a sort of great power kind of realist type competition where you convince yourself that, of course, it's foolish to. If you're going to compete with China, the last place we need to compete with them is Hong Kong and Taiwan, right on their borders. We can take care of our hemisphere; they'll take care of their area. That's not an unfamiliar argument either. So, having a great power appear or rising great power, challenging one. Again, when everyone in my generation thinks of George Kennan, I wasn't around then, but I read it, of course, in college. The close of George Kennan's Foreign Affairs article, and this will be kind of a inspiring challenge to this generation of Americans and so forth. And there was some truth to that, but it can also be a not so inspiring challenge. It can lead to a kind of defeatism, but more likely, I would think, to a kind of Trumpian combination of bellicosity occasionally, but more retrenchment, really. and certainly no great concern for allies. I mean, that's what Aaron stresses in the conversation. Anyway, it's a huge question. I think it's a true. It seems true that that's going to be increasingly dominant for the next, well, for the foreseeable future, and so that's something to think about a lot in terms of thinking through. And this is why I do think it's kind of a fresh moment also in foreign policy. The Middle East was front and center, I think reasonably so. I'm not one of those who thinks that was all a huge mistake to get so wrapped up in the Middle East. I think it remains very important, but it just does seem like China is central now in a way that it wasn't quite in the past. On the Democratic Party, Jeff's question, another very big question. I guess I would say this: I am a little heartened by, what I see. I don't know that it's quite going to be like the said nothing. History doesn't repeat itself, so it won't be quite like the '70s with ex-Democrats moving over to the Republican Party. But why do we assume that AOC or Ilhan Omar is the future of the Democratic Party rather than Alison Spanberger or Chris Coons? I don't know. I mean, they're elected too, and they're pretty moderate. And on foreign policy, I don't think that far from where I am. And to the degree that they would be different, it probably would have to do with a couple of discrete decisions. I guess Iraq is the big one. Who knows how they actually would have voted, incidentally, in 2003. Most of the people they look up to voted for it. But nonetheless, that's now honestly sort of past, in the sense that they can tell liberals they would never do anything as foolish as that, and then go ahead and I think be pretty tough-minded and pretty principled in foreign policy. Though, again, it does sort of come down to, there is hard power underneath the soft power, and are people willing to be serious about the hard power side of it? And that's a defense budget question. And it's this, how seriously does one stand up for a place like Hong Kong? How much pain is one willing to, put on China the way we did on the Soviet Union at different times, but also on ourselves? And in this discussion I had with Aaron Friedberg to tie the two together, we discussed, people just forget, how everything we did in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and we did it in zigs and zags, and some of it was probably foolish. Some of it went overboard, obviously. Some of it was the opposite. We had very foolish wars, and there's a war in Vietnam. But still, the degree to which we were willing to do a lot of things, that is not clear. That's not clear to me yet. And just to get to the political point, therefore, is the Democratic Party hard-headed about the kind of challenges we face, and how important do they think it is to, stand up for liberal democracies around the world? And President Obama believed in liberal democracy and believes in it, and was spoke about it eloquently, but also, said, I remember saying this to someone in the Obama White House, 2011, he gave the speech, 10 or 11, that we're going into Afghanistan, we're surging troops, but we're going to get out, don't worry, very soon. And then in 2011, when he announced the withdrawal that he had, foreshadowed, or now pre-announced almost, he said something about how, it's a good cause, there's some good causes there in Afghanistan, but nation building begins at home. And I remember saying to someone I knew in the Obama administration, that was a huge mistake to say. I can see why he wanted to say it. It sounds good. It's attractive. This presidential campaign coming up, but that is Pat Buchanan. That if you start saying that, if you make it seem that we have to get out of, every foreign policy obligation we have, because otherwise we can't do nation building at home. It's one thing to say the war is too difficult, it's not worth this. That's a separate issue. But if you're making the choice, nation building at home or modest interventions abroad, that's very bad, I think. And Obama couldn't quite resist going down that road. And obviously, since then, the Republicans have gone down that road in a big way. And so I think Biden's instincts are pretty good on that. But again, we'll see what happens when people say, wait, we got to take some of this money out of defense and so forth. I think Biden's old-fashioned enough on the alliance issue that he'll be reluctant to sort of cut back too much on what he takes, that's the world he's lived in. And I think he has some appreciation for why it's important. But that's where I guess Jeff's question, where the future of the Democratic Party is so important.
Bill, thank you. So we're officially over time, but we're going to finish the list of Ron and Susan, and then after that, Ellen and Charles. And if I may ask, gosh, it's not fair to you all who, get at this point in the queue, but do your best to speak in sentences and not in fat paragraphs. Ron and then Susan.
Ron actually had to depart for the evening, unfortunately. So, Susan.
So thank you, Danielle, our associate publisher, Danielle. Susan, over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you, Bill. Very interesting discussion and depressing and frightening times. There's only so much that Rosé can help. See, my question is, the current, crisis, pandemic, and the riots. The extreme fringes have more influence here and elsewhere. And in the current crisis, people aren't even agreeing if it's coming from the left or the right. Is there a plan that thinks bigger, that creates an umbrella that can bring more people back into the mainstream, one aligned with the American interest vision, back to the center? How do we use this moment to rebuild and bring the disenfranchised back to the middle?
I'm going to give a very brief answer, then we can go to the final two questions. I did this little project with Bill Galston, who's a friend of many people on this call, I think, in 2017, called the New Center Project. And it was a very modest project. And there was an attempt to prove at a time of when hyperpolarization was already widely viewed as a problem and Trump had been elected, and there were bitter political fights across the spectrum, that, you could look at a bunch of issues and discover, reasonable, not consensus, but a reasonable frame of debate. And a fair amount of consensus even on certain aspects of what's really happening and what at least should be considered to be done. And this was a pretty, modest effort, and we did a modest report making this thing. And I was struck by how much reaction it got, and not because we incidentally particularly promoted it, honestly, and not because it was a very sexy document or anything, but it just, people wanted to hear that it was possible that there could be a new center. And I do think that's a good sign. I mean, it doesn't create one, and it doesn't do the hard work of what it would mean to be a new center, either intellectually or institutionally or politically, and especially with the two-party system and all that. I mean, would it actually be a party? Would it be the parts of two parties? What would it look like to have a sort of viable center, either in foreign or domestic policy, or at least for some foreign and domestic policies? But I think there is more interest and eagerness for that than a look at the headlines or a look at it on the streets would suggest. And so that's a good sign, I think.
A little bit of optimism.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Susan, thank you. And Bill, thanks. Danielle, you heard her voice a few moments ago, our associate publisher. Danielle, if you were there, can you share in chat with people the interview that TAI did, Davidson Gedman, with Bill Kristol and Bill Galston, because some of these things are tended to, and we can share that around. Thank you, Danielle. Ellen Bork. I can't tell if Ellen is still there.
It looks like she may have departed, but I can read her question if you'd like.
Please do.
All right. Having just concluded that it might be difficult to restore a certain approach to the liberal democratic order in the future, what should those of us who want a bipartisan policy towards China do?
Thanks, Danielle. Ellen Bork. Bill?
I mean, we need to make the case for it in both parties and really find concrete things to work on. I do think this is, what I've learned in politics to some degree is I come at it more from, having been an academic and studying political philosophy. So you sort of think, well, you have to get the ideas first, the intellectual structure first, and then we'll figure out, we'll deduce our way down to the actual policies. That's actually not how the real world often works. It's not even how the intellectual world really works, but often you can find particular things to agree on more easily than getting everyone together to agree on some construct or strategy that requires, perhaps that's hard intellectually, and also hard for people to give up their priors, as we say these days. Whereas actually just agreeing on, let's do this about Hong Kong, or let's make sure let's get Taiwan admitted to international organizations, or let's do this or that with China, is sometimes easier. So I'd be pretty practical minded. What things, and leaving Trump aside for a minute, I would mostly say, what things could you get senators and congressmen and others of some influence to agree on with respect to China policy? And there are some things that one can think of. Some things are happening anyway, and others the case is being made for them. And that would be healthy. And one practical thing can lead to another practical thing even if you don't have kind of some grand theoretical agreement on what the world's going to look like or should look like in 2030 or 2050.
Bill, thank you. Sorry, I'm losing you here. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And Danielle sent around the interview we did with you and Bill Galston. So, Charles, are you still with us? And did you want to pose your question, or were you withdrawing your question? But I didn't want to neglect you.
Given the time, I'm going to withdraw my question because it opens cans of worms. So Bill and I can talk about it some other time.
Okay, Charles, thank you. And then we want to have Bill back for more cans of worms, because the reason why this went 10 minutes over is because you were so interesting, Bill, and so many people think that you have light to shed on these really hard questions. I have a concluding question for you, Bill. We're all immersed in trying to understand these challenges, and they are daunting. And we've all been living in some sort of lockdown for the last 3 months or so. And my question to you is, in lockdown, in quarantine, what do you, and Susan, if I may say, what do you listen to? If you listen to music, what do you watch? If you watch Netflix or Hulu or whatever, what are you reading?
Susan was praising to me the other day your musical recommendations, which you've been doing for the last, 2-3 weeks, which are really excellent and mostly go above my head, but of course Susan appreciates them, so that's good. We're actually it's been sort of busy. I mean, I'd say one would think one would have so much more spare time, but as this shows, one ends up on various Zoom calls. And a lot of them are fun and interesting, and which maybe one wouldn't have done actually if not in lockdown. So I guess I'm not reading, the 900-page novels I should have read that I've never read. I guess one should be doing that in this moment, but I'm not been doing that. So we did see but luckily, the opera companies are live streaming stuff and making stuff available for free. So we saw Figaro from the Vienna State Opera. It's pretty good. I thought I think it was Saturday. That was nice. Mozart's my favorite, as you know. Otherwise, I've been reading some, Donald Westlake and all my favorite light authors. And I did see, we don't watch that much. We probably should do more Netflix and movies and stuff, but we did see the pretty recent, I guess, Emma, Jane Austen's Emma, which was the movie from just last year, which is actually, at first I was sort of a little stylized and kind of almost campy, and I was kind of put off, but actually I think it's quite intelligent and interestingly done, which then led me to go back and look at Jane Austen, who was pretty fantastic. And Emma is a particularly interesting novel, a lot of great critical literature about it. So you can, one can divert oneself from some of these challenges. But honestly, having said all that, we've got this, Republican voters against Trump thing going, and I hope we'll make some difference with that. And I read the American Interest every night when you send out, the readings of the last couple of days, and usually that's a fun 5 or 10 minute read, and then sometimes it's a Giselle Donnelly piece, and I've got to set aside 2 hours, so then it's bedtime.
So listen, you all, great questions and comments, a fantastic hour and 11-minute conversation. And Bill, you're a marvel, because you can speak so intelligently to so many things, and you fight fights, but you keep us optimistic. So thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, and good luck to you all, and we'll be in touch.
Thanks, Bill. Thanks, everybody. Have a good evening. Bye now.